Welcome to our lecture on the Passion narrative. This lecture will cover basically the story of the crucifixion of Christ, just a little bit before that, kind of some of the lead-up events, through the ascension of Christ. Just briefly on that at the end of Luke, because there's a whole other video on the ascension that talks about that in greater detail when we get into the book of Acts. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this lecture on the Passion narrative. Now, I have been using an annotated outline of the New Testament. And for those of you who are in this Biblical Stories class, I've posted that for you on VCamp in the course material in week 4, which is June 21st through the 27th. And so you'll find that there. We won't use it in great detail, but if I make some references to you, I thought that would help. For each of those points on that annotated outline, I made a summary statement, which gives us kind of an overarching theme throughout that passage, throughout the passage that we're covering. And the summary statement for this section is the story of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus finally reveals God's plan to provide a means of salvation and hope for the world. And so that ties into this element that we've been talking about in Act 4. I'm using the outline now from the table of contents in the Goheen and Bartholomew text. Act 4, the coming of the King, restoration accomplished. And that restoration is accomplished in the person of Christ. Now, we talked about in Act 3, restoration initiated. And then Act 4 is the story of Christ. That's restoration accomplished. And then we will see in the last week where we'll deal with Act 5 and 6, in which we'll talk about the mission of the church in Act 5. And then in Act 6, restoration completed, that fullness, that final kind of judgment that we're talking about. But this section focuses really on the accomplishment of the work of Christ as the culmination of God's plan to bring about redemption and restore the peace or shalom that was fractured in Act 1, or actually Act 2, in the fall. And so we want to kind of dig into that. Now, part of the reading assignment for this week is Luke chapters 22, 23, and 24. And we're going to dig into that passage now. At the beginning of chapter 22, we have a little bit there in verses 1 through 6. Open your Bibles there if you're following along. In Luke chapter 22, verses 1 through 6, we learn a little bit about the plot to kill Jesus. And one of the things that we find out here is the religious elite of Jesus have long since, the religious elite of Jerusalem and the religious elite of Judaism as a whole across Israel have long since rejected Jesus. And what they've been trying to do is to look for a way to destroy him, at a minimum to undermine the growing authority that he has in the church or in the faith. And what they really want to do is destroy him. They really want to kill him. The problem for them is that Jesus is incredibly popular amongst the Jews. And the common man, the general population, love Jesus and his teachings, and they clearly see him as a man of God, and many of them already understand him to be the Son of God, the Messiah, even though they don't completely understand what all that means or what all the implications of that. But we learn here in this passage that the religious elite, the reason they won't attack Jesus is because they're afraid of the people. Jesus always responds that he respects God and that his authority and power comes from God. We learn here yet again, the religious elite, their power and their authority does not come from God, but it comes from the people. So if they do anything to mess up the backing of these people, then they know they're going to lose power and authority as well. So we see that their true power doesn't lie in God, but it lies in the people. They don't even seem to fear God, They only fear the people. We also learn in this passage, in verses 1 through 6, that it will be one of Jesus's own who will make arrangements for Jesus's betrayal into the hands of the religious elite. There's no explanation in the biblical text anywhere, here or in any other part of the Bible, that tells us why Judas was willing to betray Jesus. We only know that he did, and as a result, it brought disaster and destruction upon his life. And there's no remediation for Judas. In fact, in the Gospel of John, every time John mentions Judas, he always says something like, Judas, comma, the one who betrayed Jesus, comma, and then whatever he was going to say about Judas. It might be, Judas gave nice greetings to all the children, but it's always going to say, Judas, comma, the one who betrayed Jesus, comma, gave nice greetings to all the children. So John kind of retains that, the bitterness of Judas's betrayal of Jesus. And what happens in this section is that Judas goes to the religious elite, and he basically says, I can deliver Jesus to your hands when the people aren't around and will see him be arrested by your people. And they rejoice, they agree with this plan, and they go on. Now, beginning in verse 7 and going on through verse 38, we find the story of the Passover meal. The Passover was the great event of the Old Testament. We talked about it back in Unit 2, I believe, that, well, really, in some ways we talked about it in week 2 and 3 because it's a big part of what Act 3, Scene 1 is all about. And we spent a long time in Act 3, Scenes 1 and 2. The Passover is the 10th plague of the 10 plagues that God used to deliver his children from exile. It's the big deliverance event, the big point of deliverance from slavery and bondage in the Old Testament that really parallels Jesus's restoration accomplished, his work on the cross and his resurrection from the grave. Those two things should be seen as parallel. Just as the Jews were delivered from slavery in Egypt, the work of Christ delivers us from slavery to sin, and we can begin to walk and work our way towards the promised land. There's clearly a parallel between Jesus as a new and great Moses. You can see that really in all of the gospel books. But if you're interested in reading more about that, you want to focus on the Gospel of Matthew, because Matthew basically portrays Jesus as a new and greater Moses, or a teacher like Moses, but greater. And so this fact that Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection happens at the Passover is historically accurate, but it's also incredibly theologically significant. Because if you remember, the way that the Israelites were able to escape the death angel, to get the death angel to pass over them while they were still enslaved in Egypt, was if they were to take a lamb and to slaughter it and to put the blood on the lintel and the doorpost of their house. And so now, with Jesus's death taking place at the same time as the Passover, so they're in Jerusalem, and all the Passover lambs are being slaughtered. And Jesus is dying around the same time as that. That imagery is important for us to see, and certainly was important for all of the gospel writers, Luke included. But again, John really emphasizes the fact that Jesus is our Passover lamb, and he dies while the lambs are being slaughtered for the Passover meal. So the Passover meal that Jesus observes with his followers. During the Passover meal, the story of the Exodus and the plagues and the Exodus, the crossing of the Red Sea, the coming of the manna, the coming of the law on Mount Sinai, all of that story is rehearsed throughout the meal. And different dishes in the meal are tied to different parts of that story. And And so this is what Jesus is partaking in and leading his disciples through this rehearsal of the Passover story. And during this meal, Jesus reveals that he is going to be betrayed. Though it's clear they can't tell by whom or how, Jesus teaches them about discipleship and about how if they want to be great in the kingdom, then they must become servants of everyone, and they shouldn't lord their leadership and their power and their influence over the others who are part of the church or part of the community of faith. That when we do that, we're like the Gentiles. And then finally, towards the end of the supper, Jesus predicts Peter's betrayal of Jesus, not once but 3 times before the night is over. And it's towards the end of this meal where Jesus breaks. When Jesus breaks from tradition, he quits following the normal pattern of the meal for Passover, and he takes some of the bread. It's very careful about the verbs it uses. It says he took the bread, he blessed the bread, he broke the bread, and he gave them the bread. And then they eat the bread. And then it says that he took the cup, and he blessed the cup, he gave them the cup, and then they drank the cup. That kind of repetition of that take, bless, give, eat, or drink is very important as we see this story unfold throughout Luke chapters 22, 23, and 24. And then following this meal, this is when this blessing of the bread and of the cup are where the roots of our practice of the Lord's Supper or communion come in. And we follow this same pattern of remembering Christ's death, burial, and resurrection until he comes by celebrating the Lord's Supper and examining ourselves before we participate in the Lord's Supper so that we can take it in a worthy manner. Not that any of us are ever worthy to take it, but we can take it in a worthy manner. Now, from the Garden of Gethsemane, from the Lord's Supper, after they have the Passover meal and they end, it says they sang a hymn and then they went out into the night. They went down to the Garden of Gethsemane, which had been a place where they were going to pray on a regular basis throughout this week. They had been doing this every night. This particular Thursday night was no different after the Passover meal. They go into the Garden of Gethsemane, which is a wonderful place to visit if you have a chance, because it's one of the places where we know exactly where it was at, and we know where Jesus was at in the garden. Now, we don't know exactly where he kneeled in the garden, even though you go there today, there's a place marked, but we know it was in that garden. He was in that 50, 60, 70 foot area right around there praying during this time. And this struggle, Jesus really struggles in his prayers. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he prays, and you see his full humanity here. He doesn't want to die. He doesn't want to go through the suffering, but he knows he will be obedient to God's word. So even as he prays, Lord, if there's any way that you can take this cup away from me, please do so. But nonetheless, I will be obedient, and I will take this cup and drink it. And as he's praying through the night, his disciples are unable to stay awake with him, and basically kind of leaving him on alone to deal with all of these anxieties and concerns that are being heaped upon him. And towards the end of the night, Judas arrives with the temple police and those who are going to arrest him, kind of a mob that come out with swords and clubs and arrest Jesus. Judas kisses Jesus on the cheek. This is a sign of friendship or even familial relationship. In other words, it's a sign of close friendship or family relationship. And Judas uses this kind of symbol of intimacy as a way to betray Jesus. And Jesus goes with them, and they're taken away to the house of Caiaphas. We're almost into verse 66 of Luke chapter 22. They take him away into the house of Caiaphas, who's the high priest, to see what they're going to do about him. Along the way, all of the other disciples basically scatter. Peter does kind of follow along at a distance to see where they're taking Jesus. But once he gets close, he always stays kind of blended into the crowd, hidden in the crowd. And when he gets to the courtyard, he's even amongst that really people who are really close to where Jesus is at. Peter is recognized and asked several times, basically saying, this guy was with Jesus. And Peter denies he has any knowledge or relationship with this man at all. He does this not once, but just as Jesus had predicted at the Last Supper, Peter denies the Lord 3 times. Luke's gospel is really interesting because it says when he denied him the 3rd time, not the cock also crowed. That's the sign that Jesus gave. But here's what Luke says. Here's what Luke does, gives us a detail that the other Gospels don't. In verse 61 of Luke 22, it says, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to them, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. This is the word of the Lord. So in this passage there in verse 61, we see that Peter was so close in the courtyard to Jesus that when he denied him the 3rd time, he and Jesus made eye contact. And Peter remembered what had taken place, and the bitterness was great for him to deal with. Now here, once he's in the courtyard, Jesus is taken on trial before the Sanhedrin. And here Jesus is going to stand face to face with the most powerful religious leaders in Jerusalem and all of Judaism. And he is bolder about his identity and what he's here to do with them than he has been with anyone else. This is his time. This is when Jesus is going to confront them with his identity, and they're going to flat out reject him. Let's read together now. I'm in Luke chapter 22 and verse 66. You can see here. When day came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together, both chief priests and scribes. And they led Jesus away to their council. And they said, if you are the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. So they all said, are you the Son of God then? And he said to them, you say that I am. Then they said, what further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips. This is the word of the Lord. Now this passage is very interesting. A little bit of background is kind of interesting as well. Like, for example, according to the rules of the Sanhedrin, they were only allowed to meet during the daylight hours, but here they're clearly meeting in the pre-dawn hours and just barely getting the day started. And so there's a little bit issue there. And they ask him very plainly, making no bones about it. If you're the Christ, tell us. Jesus says, you know what? I could tell you, but there's no way you're going to believe me. You haven't believed anything else that I've said. But very soon, you're going to know exactly who I am, because I'm going to ascend to be with the Father, and I'm going to be sitting down with the Father in heaven. And they ask him point blank here now. They're putting him on point. Are you the Son of God? And Jesus' response, it sounds kind of cryptic to us. You say that I am, but I don't think we need to make it cryptic. when he says, "You say that I am," he basically is saying, "That seems to be your testimony." And they immediately respond with condemnation. So just based on their response to him, hey, we don't need to hear anything further. We've heard it for ourselves. This man is guilty. They find him guilty of blasphemy. Here before the Sanhedrin, Jesus acknowledges that he is the Son of God. That would have been a blasphemous statement to them. We should also know that blasphemy in Judaism is an offense that is a capital punishment. It's punishable by death. You can see that for yourself back in Leviticus chapter 24 and verse 16 with a host of other things that are described here a host of other things that are described as capital punishments as well. But blasphemy is there. Now, might also encourage you to go and read Mark chapter 14, verses 55 and 56, or Matthew chapter 26, verses 57 and through 68. And in both of those stories, you're going to see that that both of those authors talk about how they tried to get two witnesses against Jesus. In Judaism, you had to have two witnesses against someone before you could get a charge applied. Now, once the charge was applied, then the court, here the Sanhedrin, would make a decision about the individual's guilt or innocence, but you couldn't even put a charge against someone unless you had two witnesses. This is kind of like in our court system, where we really have a strong emphasis on corroborating evidence. Now, if you go back and look at those Matthew passage and in the Mark passage that I mentioned earlier, in both of those scenarios, it tells us they had bribed people to give false testimony against Jesus. Get two witnesses, false testimony. But when the witnesses came in and gave testimony, their stories didn't agree enough to actually validate two witnesses to get the charge punished against each other. And in those stories, it says at that point, the high priest begins to question Jesus directly. Are you the Son of God? And this is where Luke picked up with the story, and the big emphasis on what Luke is doing in this story focuses on that. So they found him guilty of blasphemy now, and they're going to want to put him to death. But herein lies the problem for the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin, under the Romans, were not allowed to execute. If they felt like someone deserved the death penalty, they had to turn the person over to the Roman court system and push charges against them and let the Romans make the decision. In this particular case, the man in charge of Judea is Pontius Pilate. He happens to be in Jerusalem because it's the Passover, and that's a likely time for trouble, although he normally would have lived up north in the northwest on the coast at Caesarea Maritima, a lovely Roman-style village that Herod the Great had built several decades earlier. And so they've got to get Pilate's permission, who's currently staying probably at the fortress of Antonia on the north side of the Temple Mount, which is where they had located the Romans had built a large fortress there. And so they've got to take him there and get a charge against him and get him condemned. So that's what we find in chapter 23. In chapter 23, verses 1 through 25, we find Jesus having been found guilty of blasphemy before the Sanhedrin, now taken for trial before Pilate. Now, if you'll look in your Bibles in chapter 23, in verses 1 and 2, look at the charges that the religious elite make against Jesus. Let me read for you here. Chapter 23 of Luke, verse 1. Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. So what exactly do the charges do they make against Jesus? There's no hint of blasphemy. They say Jesus is telling us not to pay our taxes, and Jesus is trying to set himself up as a king. Now, I don't know if we've talked about this before or if it's mentioned in Goheen and Bartholomew, but the Romans were concerned with a lot of things, but there were two things that you had better do that really become a definition for what it means to keep the peace of Rome, to keep the Pax Romana. They want to make sure that everybody pays their taxes, pays them on time and when they're asked to, and the amount that they're asked to. And the second thing is they want no rebellion, no uprising, nobody trying to set up a kingdom against the one that they've established. And looky here, both of those were the two most salacious charges that could be made against someone in the days of the Roman Empire. And they have leveled both of them at Jesus. Now I ask you, what were they found guilty of? What did they find Jesus guilty of before the Sanhedrin? Blasphemy. Now, what do they charge him with? Well, I guess you could say he is saying he's the Christ. That means like a king. But notice they interpret it. They didn't say the Christ, the Messiah, the promised anointed one. They didn't define it in the traditional sense at all, but rather they defined it in a way that would prick the ears of the Romans. He is saying he's a king. He is setting up his kingdom. Well, there is no king but Caesar. There is no kingdom but Rome. And that's going to cause problems immediately. Not only that, but they also throw in, he's telling us not to pay our taxes. Now, it's true. If you read back, I believe in chapter 19 of Luke, might be chapter 20, but I'm pretty sure it's chapter 19. If it's in 20, it's the first part of the chapter. They asked Jesus, should we pay our taxes or not? And Jesus said, yes, pay your taxes. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and what belongs to God, to God. So they're not even fairly representing what they already knew Jesus taught about taxes. That they were necessary and part of our responsibility. And so they make these charges against Jesus. This is a far cry from blasphemy, isn't it? And even notice what Pilate picks up on. Pilate begins to question Jesus in verses 3 through 5, and he specifically talks to him about, are you a king? Are you a king? And Jesus is somewhat cooperative, I think, with him in responding to him, but he fixates on that. Pilate is very quick to realize that what's going on here is some political conflict, religious political conflict between the religious elite and Jesus and his followers. And Pilate tries to get out of having anything to do with it at all. He learns that Jesus is a Galilean, and so he sends Jesus off to Herod Antipas, who's the ruler, the king, or the ruler of Galilee and Perea, who happens to be in town for the Passover. And so Herod Antipas gets to meet Jesus. And Herod Antipas was actually kind of excited about it. He had heard about Jesus' miracles, but had never seen one. Jesus basically refuses to do any miracles. Herod dresses him up kind of like a king by putting a royal purple robe on him and sending him back to Pilate unjudged. Herod is wise enough to know not to get involved. Herod Antipas is wise enough to know not to get involved. So the trial before Pilate picks back up in verse 13 and continues on through 25. Pilate confronts the religious leaders, but they basically refuse to listen to him. He even tries to kind of reason with them. He says, it's a tradition that I release a prisoner during the Passover. Really, there's no record of them ever doing that. I think Pilate's trying to make himself sound nice. And I have two prisoners that I can release for you. I can release this Jesus, who seems to be a peaceful, loving creature, and I can find no fault with him at all. Or I can release for you Barabbas, who is an insurrectionist. He is one who's trying to set up a kingship. And not only that, he's a murderer. He's been found guilty of all of these things. Who do you want me to release for you? Barabbas or Jesus? And the religious elite stir up the crowd, and they're all encouraged to call for the release of Barabbas. And then he asked them, well then, what would you have me do to this Jesus? And again, stirred by the crowd, they call out, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. What I mean by the called out by the crowd, I mean the religious elite provokes the crowd to call for the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, if I might just pause for a minute. This person of Barabbas is not brought in here by accident at all. But it really is showing us a miniature snapshot, or a snapshot, it doesn't have to be miniature, a snapshot of the gospel. And by that I mean Barabbas, who is guilty of the crimes, murder, insurrection, Barabbas is allowed to go free. But Jesus, who is innocent of the crimes, he actually takes the horrific punishment and crucifixion and death that Barabbas actually enjoyed. How great of a day do you think this was for Barabbas? The best day of his life, man. He thought he was going to the cross. He thought he was going to crucifixion. He was wrong. He's going home. He's being delivered from the just penalty that was deserved of him. That's why it's kind of a snapshot of the gospel. Christ not only died in Barabbas' place, but Christ dies in all of our places. Christ died for the sins of the world. If we'll but confess our sins, ask Christ to forgive us of our sins, and acknowledge the truth of his death, burial, and resurrection, and live for him, submit to his lordship, then we will receive that blessing indeed, that redemption from our sins. This passage is a small picture of the transaction that is made for you and I in the gospel. We who are guilty are released, but Christ, who was and is innocent, takes our place. If we talk about the crucifixion, what I really want you to do at this point is I want you to read an article that I put on the course materials. So if you go to June 21st through 27th, and then click on course materials, there's a couple of items there. Of course, your passage assignments for your inductive Bible study number 3 are posted there. The annotated outline of the New Testament that I've been talking about is posted there. But there's also an article there on the physical death of Jesus Christ. It's from the Journal of American Medical Associates, and I really would like for you to read all of that in its entirety, so that you can have a good understanding of not only crucifixion, which it tells us in good historical detail, but also the process of flogging in good historical detail. And I wouldn't be surprised at all to find one or two questions on one of those processes or elements involved in that on our exam this week. But basically, the story of the crucifixion is told in verses 32 through 49. We know that Jesus is taken. He's mocked and tormented since he's been found guilty of being a king in their minds. They decide that a king needs a crown, and so they make him a fictitious crown out of thorns and force it onto his head. They give him a scepter like a king would carry, only it's basically a reed. I think we should think of something like a cattail, a reed, which they take out of his hand and then smack him with it. They false worship him. They pretend to be honoring him as a king, but they're just mocking him and spitting on him and cursing at him. All of this goes through this whole passage. Even while he is really dying in our place, humanity is mocking and belittling him through that whole process. Now, once Jesus is dead, normally crucifixion was something that lasted. It took several days for a body to die, but Jesus dies rather quickly on the cross, to be perfectly honest. He's taken down not too long before sundown, which at sundown the Sabbath begins, and we're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. So his body is asked for by a man by the name of Joseph of Arimathea, and some women are working with him, and he's taken down, and his body is quickly wrapped and put in this tomb that belongs to Joseph of Arimathea. Now the plan all along is to go back after the Sabbath is over and properly prepare the body for burial, so that they'll have time to do that. They'll have time to not only prepare the items that they'll need, but they'll have the time, actually hours, to do the process. So their plan was to go back to the tomb after the Sabbath was over. This would have been Sunday morning, and to wash the body and to anoint the body with perfumes and oils, and to wrap the body in a linen cloth, which they did, but to wrap it properly. And normally burial during this time, they would bury them in these tombs, usually carved out of a rock. They would just kind of, I don't know of another way to explain it, but just to say they kind of carved little bunk beds, little holes in the wall that was long enough and tall enough to lay a body on, kind of like shelves, lengthwise, not vertically. Although some of them actually would have been, a narrow hole that went back way deep. I've actually seen it and been in a tomb that was just like that. But for the most part, they were dug wide enough for a body, all right, and then long enough for a body. And the practice during this time was to leave this body wrapped like this and allow it to decay for a year. And then somewhere around the anniversary of the person's death, the family would go back to the tomb and they would clean everything up. Mostly all that would remain at this point would be the bones. And I'm sure there was still some, now how do I say this appropriately, but other detritus that would be there. Other remains, but mostly it would have been just bones. And they would take the bones up, they would wash them, and then they would put them in a box that was actually carved from a soft stone. It's called an ossuary box. Ossary, I think. Ossuary. No, OSSU. R-A-Y, ossuary. Doggone it. I'm not sure how to spell ossuary at this moment, but you can Google it or ask Siri, and one of them will help you out. But this bone box, it's just long enough for the femur, the longest bone in the human body, to fit into, and just wide enough for the skull to fit into, and just tall enough, wide enough. Tall enough and wide enough for it to fit into, and then all the rest of the bones would easily go into that. And then that bone box, which would also have a stone lid, sometimes they were decorated with a little rosette pattern. Looks like a circle around a star to us, but it's called a rosette or a rose type pattern. Then those boxes would be stacked somewhere else in that tomb, and that was kind of like their coffins, if you will. That was the plan for Jesus's body. But something happened. Something miraculous happened. As we turn into chapter 24 of Luke and begin in verse 1, we learn that the women who had been planning to go back to the tomb to bury Jesus properly with all the proper supplies are now returning to the tomb, and in fact arrive at the tomb and find the tomb. The first thing they see is the stones rolled back. Then they discover the empty tomb, and inside of the tomb they're met by angelic host who say basically, he is not here, he is risen. Why are you looking for him amongst the dead when he's amongst the living? We have a couple of different statements from them throughout the four Gospels. But basically they're all saying Jesus is risen. He is not here. And the women are ecstatic. They run back to where the rest of the disciples have been gathering, and they begin to tell them about it. Then we hear about what we call the Emmaus Road. at one of the resurrection appearances of Jesus. We see that some of the disciples, even though they've heard the testimony of these women, they're kind of confused and they don't know exactly what's going on. They left Jerusalem that day of the resurrection, that Sunday, and walked back to what we think was maybe their hometown in Emmaus, about 6 or 7 miles to the west, northwest of Jerusalem. And as they're going, they meet a stranger on the road, and he asks them what they've been talking about, and they seem kind of incredulous. They say, "Are you the only person who does not what's been going on these last few days?" And then they tell him the story of how Jesus was crucified, how he was buried, and now it's the third day, and some of our women have gone to the tomb, and he's not there, and he's alive, but we don't completely understand all that. And what they don't know is they're talking to Jesus. They were prevented from recognizing him. Then Jesus, and they're kind of sad. They say, we thought maybe he was the one. See, they're still expecting the Messiah to be a political leader or a military leader who will conquer the Romans, when the Messiah came to do something so much more better than just topple an temporal earthly kingdom. And Jesus tells them, you should read in detail in verses 25 through 31. Jesus begins with Moses and the prophets, and he begins to tell them why the Messiah must suffer and then be tormented and then die, and then on the third day rise again. And he's talking with them, and as they go on their journey, the day starts to come to an end. They get to the point where it's time to turn off of the main road to go down into the city of Emmaus. They invite Jesus, still not knowing who he is. They invite Jesus to go and have supper with them and spend the night and then go about his journey the next day. And he agrees, and they go and they settle into one of their homes or one of their homes of one of their friends. And notice the verbs here. Jesus, they're having the typical supper of bread and whatever else. Jesus takes the bread, he blesses the bread, he breaks the bread, he gives them the bread, and when they take the bread, their eyes are opened and they recognize Jesus, and at that very moment, he disappears from their sight. Now, that disappearance is not described in any way. If you want to think about it like I often do, is kind of Star Trek, Jesus gets beamed up, or he just fades from their presence. I don't know. It just says that he disappeared. I doubt there was a magician's puff of smoke. That would be kind of hokey. It probably wasn't the Scotty beam me up either, but he just disappears. And it's at this point they realize Jesus, and they begin to tell their friends all that Jesus had taught them on the road, and how they thought, man, what he was saying made so much sense. The way they said it was, didn't our hearts burn within us? That's the Mediterranean way of saying, man, that was making a lot of sense. Smoke was coming out our ears. They were so excited, they immediately got up. Even though it was still night, they immediately got up and trucked the 6 or 7 miles uphill back to Jerusalem and began to tell the disciples, the core disciples, what had taken place for them. And as they're beginning to tell the story, we now have Jesus actually reappears in the room with the disciples. And he tells them for himself, don't you know, I was trying to tell you, I was going to go to Jerusalem, I was going to be tormented, I was going to be crucified and put to death, mocked, spit on, cursed at, buried, and on the third day I was going to raise from the grave. He says, look, see here, look at my hands and my feet, and look at my side where they pierced me. It's me. He even asked them for something to eat to prove that he's alive, and he's in the body, but he's alive in the spirit as well. He's in the body, and he eats food. And he says, spirit doesn't need food. Oh, flesh and bones need food. He eats to prove he's really alive. A bodily resurrection, not just a spiritual resurrection, but resurrected in his body. Even though we don't completely understand that, that's clearly what takes place. We see that talked about in chapter 24 verses 36 through 43. So in this passage, chapter 24 is has the lengthiest stories of the resurrection appearances of Jesus anywhere in the biblical text. It's interesting, all three of the stories in verses 1 through 12, excuse me, in all three of the stories in verses 1 through 12, we see that the female disciples, are told the story of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus by the angelic host. Then we see in the road to Emmaus, initially the disciples actually tell the story they tell the story of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus to Jesus himself, to the resurrected Lord himself. And then finally in verses 36 through 43 in Jerusalem, we see the risen Lord himself reminding them and reinforcing, the formerly dead guy himself is telling the story of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Now, Luke is doing something very important here. He is reinforcing and establishing that basic story of Christianity, and that's the story of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and the theological role that it plays in our forgiveness of sins and our discovery of new life and our escape from the brokenness that came about. It restores, the restoration of those four alienations is now accomplished. Not completed, but accomplished in the work of Christ. The relationship between God and humanity is restored. The relationship between humanity and other humanity, between others, is restored. The relationship between man and the created order is restored. And that internal peace within ourselves is restored in the story of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. We call this sermon of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, we call it the Kerugma. Kergyma. Kergyma. It's just the Greek word. It means the proclamation or the sermon. It's the sermon or the proclamation of Christianity. That's Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, if Christ is not raised, then we should be pitied, and everything we do is in vain. But Christ is raised, and so we live victoriously. It's all of that. That's the great sermon of Christianity, and it's told. Luke is going to tell it again and again because Luke writes the book of Acts that we're going into next. Luke is going to have different people throughout the book of Acts, and they're going to preach that sermon that tells not only the facts of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, but the theological significance of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, what it means for us, and how it changes the way that we live and changes all of those alienations that we talked about early on that were caused by the fall. And so that's very important. And Luke lays that down. Has angels from heaven preaching it, has disciples from earth preaching it, and has Jesus, the formerly dead guy himself, preaching it. 1, 2, 3 in Luke chapter 24. The Kerugma is established. And then finally, just briefly, because there's a whole other lecture on the Ascension that's really based on Acts chapter 1, verses 4 through 11 or 5 through 11. It's really 1 through 11, but 1 through 4 I think is mostly introduction to the book. But those first few verses retell the story of the Ascension. Here at the end of the book, in chapter 24, verses 50 through 53, we just find the simple words that Jesus went outside of the town and he ascended into the heavens and left his disciples there to continue the work. Then what Luke does as he starts really Luke volume 2, Luke Acts would be one book, but it would make too large of a scroll is what most people think. So he broke it into two separate books or scrolls so that it wouldn't be so large. And so Acts is Luke volume 2. So he uses the Ascension to overlap the two stories. He ends Luke with a brief telling of the Ascension, and then he overlaps Acts. He begins Acts with the telling of the ascension with a more greater detail and significance of how it relates to the mission of the church in that passage. You can see that in the next lecture or two that's also in this week. And so there we have the basic story of the Passion narrative. We go all the way from the plot to kill Jesus, through the execution of that plot, through the execution of Jesus, through his burial, his resurrection, and 3 legitimate accounts to the resurrection of Jesus. May the peace of Christ be with you all.